Should the women's movement be collaborating with the private sector? This is a fairly controversial question in the women's movement, and it has been the prevailing opinion that that should not be happening, that is some form of collusion with the powers that be and somehow works against women. In truth, however, if we take the economic subordination of women seriously and we look up closely at how that gets executed in the world economy, it becomes quickly pretty clear that if you're not dealing at the private sector level, there's no way to change that. And so it actually is very important at this point to be working with the private sector and to be learning about that and the way it interacts with women in a more detailed level than has been done before. I think the other thing is that this position tends to assume that it's fundamental to feminism to be critical of capitalism, that feminism somehow is a critique of capitalism. In truth, however, the data that we now have shows us that women's subordination in the economy has occurred under every economic order, is very, very old, is very widespread, and is very strong. It is in some sense the pre-existing condition. And so therefore it doesn't make sense to disengage on the actually false assumption that capitalism is somehow causal to women's subordination. That just simply is not supported by the evidence. I want you to look with me at women in agriculture around the world and talk about some of what we've been learning over just the last few years about what actually is going on and what the presence is of women in agriculture. We're accustomed actually in our thinking to imagine that women in the global north are very, very different and have very different circumstances economically, especially from women in the global south. In truth, there are a lot of similarities, and they're systemic. So for example, in the speech this morning, I gave the number that women around the world, or in 106 countries documented by the Food and Agriculture Association, own 18.3% of the world's land, or roughly 18.3% of the world's land. And that actually in the richer nations, that number is lower. And the reason for that is that over time, essentially the world has operated under the Downton Abbey principle, and that is that land can only pass from male to male. And while there have been exceptions, there have been land reforms throughout time, these have tended to be temporary. Now this is significant because if you flip that around, it means that men have controlled 80% or more of the land in the world over time. Now, since land is the major store of wealth for the foundation of most societies, what that means is that that has rolled up into better access to capital, more capital equipment, more access to technology, and eventually, as the world industrializes and moves on to the information society, it means that men control 80% plus of the world's capital. Now, that not only means it's harder for women to get access to capital for their own businesses, it means that the employers that give us jobs are largely owned by men, right? And so it becomes a systemic problem, one that is different only in its particulars, really, and has to be addressed as a systemic problem that women in the North and South actually share.